My name is Jonathan Spellman, and I teach philosophy at Ohio Northern University. If you're watching this, I suspect you're participating in the AAPT's summer series, and in this presentation, I'm going to make the case for casuistry. You might think of casuistry as a long ago rejected method of doing ethics, but I'm going to argue that it has something to teach us, or that it has some tools that we can use as we're teaching practical or applied ethics. All right, so the context. The class that I'm sort of thinking of when I'm thinking about using casuistry is a sort of lower level applied ethics course, though I suspect it could be used at upper level courses and in a broad range of ethics courses. I teach professional ethics, environmental ethics, even teach philosophy of law, and I sort of use some of these principles in all of those classes. But I'm going to focus on this ethics, justice, and law class to give you a sense for how casuistry fits in. So when I think about learning objectives, I think first about content objectives. So what do I want them to learn about? What's the material? In this class, we talk about topics related to ethics, topics related to justice, topics related to the law. So the students learn some theories related to each of those areas, and then we apply those theories to some cases in each of those areas. I also want students to learn some skills. So can they construct valid arguments? Can they use thought experiments and counterexamples? Can they use analogical reasoning? These are all things that I want them to develop in the class. In particular, we're going to think about how the methods of casuistry sort of are bolstering students' abilities to develop thought experiments and counterexamples and to reason analogically. Finally, I have some habit of mind goals for my students. These are harder to assess, but they are things that I want students to sort of take away from the class, and teaching casuistry, I think, supports a couple of those, developing intellectual empathy and developing intellectual humility. So I want to start with a sort of problem that kind of motivates the use of casuistry. So consider a common case, right? Nazi soldiers approach a French village during World War II. A girl tells Jacques that if he's Jewish, he can hide in her family's house. He is Jewish, and so he does hide in her house. When soldiers knock on the girl's door and ask whether there are any Jews there, the family says that there aren't. So the soldier leaves, and Jacques survives the war, eventually moving to the United States, happily ever after. This, I think, is a real case from Marrow's moral reasoning. And let's start with a question, right? Was it permissible for the girl and her family to lie to the Nazi soldiers? And if so, why? If not, why not? Take a moment, right? Think for yourself. What answer would you give? And how would you justify that? What would your argument be? How would you try and convince someone that that was the right solution? Once you're done, unpause and continue on with the video. All right, so the problem as I see it is this. The moral theories that we want to use to justify our answers to practical questions like this one are going to be vulnerable to counterexamples, which leaves us at a bit of an impasse. So the Kantian maybe says, well, lying is wrong, it violates the categorical imperative, so no, the girl's behavior was not okay. Whereas the consequentialist says, look, it maximized utility, and so, yeah, she did the right thing. If we're stuck in sort of thinking about practical questions from the theoretical perspective, then we can't make any progress. We're just going to sort of like double down on our theories. But we want to make progress, and if we want to do that, then we need to find some other way to do it. The casuist solution to this problem is to not argue sort of deductively, starting with some sort of theory and then applying it, but rather to take paradigm cases and compare them, see how the case in question sort of fits relative to those paradigms. So when we think about the murder of the door, we think a case of lying, right? And lying is generally wrong. So making a false promise to benefit yourself, that's going going to be impermissible. It's off the table. But then we see these other cases where lying looks like it's permissible. So imagine a priest, right, who's confessant, who says he's been cheating on his spouse. And maybe later someone asks, is so-and-so cheating on their spouse? And the confessor, right, the priest, what are they going to do in that case? It seems like they can't tell the truth because they're sworn to secrecy. But if they try and distract or sort of like avoid answering the question, it might look like they're hiding something. So it seems like maybe a priest can lie in that sort of situation. And we might sort of think that that situation is actually closer to the murder at the door than the false promise case, right? So we know that the confessant, I guess, is not going to tell the priest about their infidelity unless they know that the priest is going to keep it a secret. Similarly, Jacques is maybe not going to stay at the girl's house unless he knows that the girl is going to keep his secret. And so there's a way in which that information is protected and that sort of makes lying permissible. So there's an argument that doesn't appeal to sort of theories, but rather it appeals to cases and uses our intuitions about those cases to get at the conclusion that we think is the best. Now, not everyone's going to agree with the casuists' sort of verdict, right? Casuists are going to disagree among themselves about what the appropriate verdict in the case should be. So what do we do in those cases? You can see how there are going to be different answers to this question, right? It's a live philosophical question today. What do we do when experts disagree? Historically, right, there were different views about what to do here. So this one view, two-yearism, says we should play it safe. So, lying's wrong, we shouldn't lie, protect our sort of moral standing, so we should do that sort of thing. Probabiliarism is sort of a hard word to say. It's also not a word we ever use or a view we ever think about in ethics. But it says, well, we need to follow the preponderance of evidence. So what is most likely? Is it more likely permissible, or is it more likely wrong to lie in this case? And we sort of weigh the evidence, we look at the arguments, we see who's on what side of the issue. Is this person sort of a big name, famous for their good judgment, or are they not? And we sort of tally things up and go with the one that's the strongest. Now, probabilism is the view that we don't need to do what has the most support, or we don't need to go with the action that has the preponderance of evidence. Sometimes it's permissible to do something that sort of doesn't have the strongest arguments in its favor. But it doesn't need to have strong arguments in its favor. It does need to have some wise casuists supporting it in order for us to recommend it or for that action to be justified. But it can be justified. It can be okay to do, even if it doesn't have the preponderance of evidence on its side. Finally, there's laxism. This view says, as long as an action has some support, right, if some casuist out there somewhere says that it's permissible, then it's permissible to do it. You can see why probabilism and laxism seem a bit sketchy, right? So Blaise Pascal, in his Provincial Letters, really satirizes casuistry, implying if it's committed to probabilism or laxism, he makes it look really bad. And so, as a result, people abandon casuistry, and the sort of whole practice falls into disrepute. Now, Pascal's criticisms weren't altogether unfair, but they definitely weren't sufficiently charitable to probabilism or to casuistry, which isn't even committed to probabilism or laxism. So you could be a casuist, be a probabiliarist, I guess the term would be. And so that view seems perfectly fine. So there doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with casuistry necessarily. And in fact, casuistry sort of has seen a bit of a resurgence, right? So the Encyclopedia Britannica starts out with this description of casuistry, right? Not pointing to a historical view that's deeply flawed, but rather saying casuistry is a case-based method of reasoning. It's employed in field-specific branches of professional ethics, like business ethics and bioethics. It typically uses general principles in reasoning analogically from clear-cut cases called paradigms to these more vexing cases. Similar cases are treated similarly, and in this way, casuistry resembles a kind of legal reasoning. So casuistry sort of shouldn't be abandoned, and maybe it hasn't been abandoned, right? It's being brought back up, and maybe there's some value here. So what is that, right? What are the methods that we can use? I'm going to identify 5. So 1, casuists address cases, not questions. So we can't sort of answer this broad question, is lying permissible? Instead, we have to sort of, what we might say, descend into the particulars, right? That might be the Jesuit way of putting it. We've got to look at the details and look at the precise issues raised by the case. We need to use principles, not theories. So maybe prima facie rules rather than some theory like utilitarianism. Maybe those prima facie principles will be more helpful. They use cumulative arguments, not deductive ones, so we can't sort of say, here's the principle that applies in each and every case. Rather, we've got to look at what the weight of reason speaks in favor of. 4th, casuists start with clear paradigmatic cases, and they use analogical reasoning as they move on to the less clear, more controversial ones. So we'd want our students to learn those sorts of skills. Can you come up with thought experiments and counterexamples? Can you use analogical reasoning to get from those examples to the case that you're interested in? And finally, casuistry explicitly discusses probability, the probability of their conclusions, and whether or not it's permissible to act on them. So I think this is an especially interesting part of casuistry, where casuists are always sort of saying, well, this argument is probable, but it's not the most probable conclusion. And that's kind of an interesting thing to say. I'm imagining, right, how would our students rank the probability of their arguments? That might be something that's interesting to get them to think about. So why teach casuistry? Well, I'm not arguing that we ought to teach students the history or that we ought to teach them to actually be casuists. I do, however, think that when we teach students to do practical ethics, we ought to teach them some of these methods, since they promote the skills and habits of mind that we want our students to develop. So, for example, when we address cases and not questions, we prepare students to sort through the kinds of choices they'll face later in life. When we use principles and not just theories, we use cumulative arguments, not just deductive ones, we're showing students that ethics is messy, but that it requires critical thinking, right? It's not that you dig in behind your theory and sort of lob grenades at the other side, but rather we've got to sort through the intricate details. When we use paradigmatic cases and analogical reasoning, we help students appreciate opposing perspectives. If they can sort of see the paradigmatic example on the other side, they might come to better appreciate why someone thinks differently than they do. And finally, when we aim at probability rather than certainty, we're promoting the development of intellectual humility. Right? We're challenging students to do that metacognition. So how strong is my argument? And that seems like it's got to promote this approach that says, well, I could be wrong, how likely is that? That sort of thing. How do we teach it? There's a lot to say here. If you have further questions, and we can talk about those, I just want to quickly sort of run through a little bit of how I teach it. So I don't teach casuistry explicitly, but I'd like to move in that direction. And one way of sort of understanding this presentation is as sort of me trying to sort through just how far should we go in teaching this method. So right now I use handouts and homework assignments to teach students some of the relevant skills. You can check some of those out at the website listed there. I also use course readings and class discussions to model the kind of analogical reasoning that I'm looking for. And lastly, I have students practice this kind of reasoning in their papers. So here's a rubric from my paper assignment. Each of the papers that I assign has the same rubric. Students are asked to give an argument for their view that's supported by an example or a thought experiment. And so that's sort of where the paper starts. It moves on to an objection where the opponent has to give a counterexample to the principle or the sort of moral claim that they started with. So we can see that as lying is always wrong. Look at the false promise. Well, lying is not wrong if you're a priest who needs to hide some information from that was told to them in a confession. Okay, well, now in response to that, if I'm going to defend the view that lying to the murderer at the door is wrong, we need to come up with some response. Why is it wrong to lie to the murderer at the door, but okay for the priest to lie about the confession? So that is going to be challenging at times. I think it's going to push students, right, to sort of reflect on, well, which argument do I think is stronger here? Or which side do I want to be on? And so that helps motivate that. As a quick example, right, and this comes from a case Malcolm Gladwell gives in his podcast, which actually sort of served as motivation for this talk. Think of Andy Pettitte. Right? So Pettitte played in the MLB from 1995 to 2013. He has good career stats, not great. He wasn't a dominant pitcher, but he had longevity, and he was pretty good. The Yankees, in fact, he was so good, right? The Yankees retired his number in 2015. Now, Pettitte, sort of borderline Hall of Famer, but one thing that counts against him is this episode that happened back in 2002. So he suffered an elbow injury that year, and then later on he admitted that he used performance-enhancing drugs during that time to recover from his injury. But he denied ever using PEDs for an extended period, and I think let's take him for his word on that. So the question we're faced with is whether or not Andy Pettitte's PED use was morally wrong, or alternatively, like whether it should be banned, should he get in trouble for this sort of thing. Now, you might think, yeah, it definitely was, or no, it's not that bad. But again, the question is, how do you get there? How should we think through this case? Again, you might want to pause the video, think about how might a casuist think through this case. When you're done doing that, you can unpause and sort of see some of the resolution of it. All right, so we have Andy Pettitte. On the one hand, we have Barry Bonds, right? He used PEDs, he bulked up, became super strong, ended up hitting tons of home runs. So his PED use made him much better than he was before. On the other hand, we have someone like Tommy John, who had this surgery that improved his pitching ability, right? He sort of tore this ligament in his elbow, and if not for this surgery, he never would have pitched again. But he got the surgery, and he was able to pitch again, and it didn't make him like a bionic man. It wasn't like Rookie of the Year where he's suddenly throwing 120-mile-an-hour fastballs or anything. No, it just sort of brought him back to the skill level that he was at before. Now, that seems Tommy John surgery is permissible. Pitchers are allowed to do that. And what Gladwell wants to argue is that Pettitte's case is more like Tommy John's case. And his PED use didn't give him some advantage. It just sort of helped him back to health a little bit quicker than he could have gotten there otherwise. It wasn't like Barry Bonds, who used PEDs to bulk up to become a better player. All right, so the question right at the end is like, well, which side should we be on? Are there morally relevant differences maybe between Pettitte's case and Tommy John's case that would justify our distinguishing between those two? Or maybe on the other side, right? Important differences between Bond's case and Pettitte's case that makes us think we should lean more towards the permissibility of any code section. Again, maybe think about it for yourself. Think about what kind of examples you might use to speak in favor of your conclusion. Finally, I've come up with some questions for reflection. You're welcome to take a look at these questions, right? Pause, read through them, sort out which ones maybe are interesting to you, or of course they're, I'm open to any questions on Wednesday that you might come up with. But these might get you thinking about how you might modify your class, or how maybe you think I'm wrong in arguing for casuistry, and you can sort of push back a little bit me there. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hopefully I'll see you on Wednesday,